I suspect that I'm first to compare Swedenborgianism to a kind of underground river that flows in a largely invisible way, but nonetheless waters and nurtures plants that then spring up above the ground. In the United States, of course, we can immediately think of examples like Henry James, the father of Henry and William, Helen Keller, Johnny Appleseed, and no doubt many others. But the interesting point here is the issue of invisibility, how few people are aware of Swedenborg directly and his teachings, even though he's influenced so many of our important people. And I think probably all of you know a lot more about that than I do. So the first topic that I want to talk about, though, is how actually Swedenborgianism has been important in the introduction and development of Buddhism in the United States. Again, something else that virtually nobody is aware of on either side, except maybe for some of you in the audience here. For example, until today, when I met Louis Shaw's son, I had never met an American Buddhist practitioner who had ever heard or knew anything about Swedenborg. But it also works the other way around. I had occasion to read Marguerite Bloch's book, The New Church and the New World, and even the third edition, published in 1984, it has no mention in the index of either Herman Vetterling or his pen name, Philangi Dasa, who published the first Buddhist journal in the English-speaking world, the Buddhist Ray, and also wrote a book that actually became somewhat influential in Japan, Swedenborg the Buddhist, or The Higher Swedenborgianism. Likewise, her book doesn't have a word in the index for Buddhism or for D.T. Suzuki. Now, D.T. Suzuki, however, that's a name maybe to conjure with, and I'm just curious. I know that there's a lot of other gray hairs and gray beards in the audience. I wonder how many of you are familiar with D.T. Suzuki, if I could ask for a raise of hands? Okay, the vast majority. How many of you have read a book by him? Back in the time when I came of age, in the late 60s, he was enormously influential. And really, I doubt very much whether myself, whether me, or many other people of that time would have actually begun Zen practice if we hadn't become acquainted with all of his English-speaking works on Zen. I remember one of my first Zen teachers, Robert Aiken of the Diamond Sangha, mentioning that in a way, we're not only all indebted to Suzuki, in a way, we're all his children. Unfortunately, his star is not shining quite as brightly as it once did. Contemporary scholarship is concerned, well, historians raise the question of how much he may have been supporting Japanese militarism during World War II, a really complicated controversy that I'm not in a position to say anything about. But even more than that, there's this big concern among scholars, Buddhologists, that he may have actually romanticized or adapted the understanding of Zen, and especially Zen enlightenment, that actually was influenced perhaps as much by American figures, somebody like William James, as it is from the way that Zen is actually practiced in a place like Japan. But the other really interesting thing about Suzuki is that although he was enormously influential in terms of promoting Swedenborgianism in Japan, he translated four of Swedenborg's books from English into Japanese. He wrote his own book on Swedenborg, which has been retranslated back into English, and it's available. But all of this was in his early days. And by the time in his later life, when he was writing lots and lots of books in English on Zen, at that point, he stopped talking about Swedenborg. He hardly ever mentioned him. He even wrote a book about Zen and Christian mysticism, which was all about Meister Eckhart. And I don't remember if he even mentioned Swedenborg, probably not, but if he did, he wouldn't have gone into any more detail. Which raises a very interesting question. Why did he shift in that way? Why did he evidently lose his interest in Swedenborg? Was it just a tactical decision in terms of what would appeal to people in the United States or in the English-speaking world? Or did his understanding shift in some way? Something that I'm going to want to come back to in a moment. Let me just start by asking, why would a Swedenborgian be interested in Buddhism? Why might a Buddhist be interested in Swedenborgianism? Well, as one would expect, there are lots of similarities and differences, and as you would expect from someone who's written on the topic, I tend to think that the similarities are more interesting and more important than the differences in many ways. But in particular, there's one that I really want to focus on and pull out, because I think it's the most important similarity of all, that I think both Swedenborg and the Buddhist tradition really show us that the essence of religion, what religion or genuine spirituality is all about, is genuine personal transformation at the very deepest possible level. As somebody who's lived and traveled in many different places, I've been very fortunate in that, like, every time I moved to a new place, a couple years ago I moved to Cincinnati from Japan, and then I moved from Cincinnati to Boulder and so forth. But every time I move to a new place, what happens is always the same. Because of my interest in Buddhism, I make a connection with the local people there, the local Buddhists, and suddenly what I find is I'm welcomed into a community of very genuine, warm, good-hearted people. Because again, the Buddhist emphasis, people who really engage in Buddhist practice, it's not about simply taking on some kind of role, but it's really this understanding about transforming yourself. And the reason I mention that, of course, is although I don't know nearly as many Swedenborgians, my experience has been exactly the same when I've encountered them, that there's a genuine and warmth and sincerity there, which comes from the fact that we realize spirituality isn't simply a matter of somehow qualifying for a critical way to sort of make it into heaven, but that really what we need to do is, as Swedenborg says, transform our self-love or self-preoccupation into an other love and a compassion and a concern for our fellow man, and live in a way that expresses that. The importance of not just believing in that, but also actually living it. Buddhism doesn't talk so much about the evil of self-love versus the good of living for others in a certain way, but rather the central axis for the Buddhist tradition is not good versus evil, but delusion versus awakening, or ignorance versus enlightenment. So what Buddhism emphasizes, but I think it's really trying to the same thing in different terminology. What Buddhism emphasizes is the importance of letting go of the sense of self, of having a kind of an opening. In Zen, we sometimes talk about the experience of kensho or enlightenment as the bottom falling out of the bucket. Very interesting concept. The idea that somehow the ego self, what Swedenborg called the proprium, there's a kind of a relaxation and opening, and then an opening to that which flows up, the influx. So even though in Buddhism we don't usually talk about the influx, I think it's not very difficult to understand Buddhist teachings in that way, that awakening enlightenment is opening up to the realization that we're part of something greater than ourselves, and that it's important for us to not only realize that, but to manifest it. Now, saying that, of course, although we're talking here about Buddhism and Swedenborg, this is also something that applies to a lot of other spiritual traditions, doesn't it? And that's something we need to acknowledge and I think remember. I mean, we can immediately, in the Abrahamic traditions, think of Christian mysticism, think of Sufis such as Rumi and Ibn Arabi, or the Jewish Hasidim. It seems to me that there's something very similar going on in all of them, which to some extent we can trace back to also Neoplatonism in the European tradition. The emphasis that we have always been a part, or let's say, a manifestation, an expression, or a presencing of something greater than ourselves, which in Buddhist terms, this something in and of itself has no name or form that we can ever get a hold of. But that's the point. We don't need to get a hold of it. We need to open up to it so that it can express itself through us and as us. And I think this is a really important point, even though it may in one way seem quite obvious, because our situation now with the globalization and the fact that we're so much more aware not only of other people and other cultures, but of their spiritual traditions. I think we've really gotten to the point where we can see the growing tip for all spiritual traditions today is other spiritual traditions, what we can learn from them, and how there's this really important challenge, whether in the modern world, when we have to inevitably rub shoulders with other traditions in ways that we didn't have to do so much before. In this process of rubbing shoulders, are we going to have the kind of fundamentalist reaction where we become very uncomfortable with the differentness that other traditions offer us, that they have different vocabularies, different ways of talking, different ways of living? Are we going to be uncomfortable about that and shrink back in a fundamentalist way to hold on ever more tightly to our own teachings and our own practices? And there's plenty of fundamentalism in Buddhism too, by the way. Or rather, it's the opportunity, inevitably involving some anxiety, some discomfort, but the opportunity to really ask, can our experience of these other traditions enable us perhaps to begin to distinguish what's really essential about our own tradition from what is maybe culturally, historically less important? The metaphor that comes to mind for me is a tumbling jar, like the kind of tumbling jar where you put in lots of stones and they just tumble for hours and days and weeks. Well, what happens? After a while, the stones polish each other. And I guess my vision, my hope is that in the process, a process that I don't think we can really avoid anymore in our shrinking, globalizing world, in the process of doing this, that this is really us to learn so much about different traditions, and certainly given the kind of urgent situation of the world today, we certainly need to do that. Going back to the relationship between Swedenborgianism and Buddhism, my sense, and please correct me later if I'm wrong, my sense is that despite the incredible interest and growth in the Swedenborgian churches that occurred in the middle and the late 1800s, there's a sense in which although Swedenborgianism has fed and nurtured so many important people, still as a church, that it never has been able to achieve the success or the influence or the visibility that one might hope. And the reason I ask about that is because I wonder if it is also perhaps relevant to the situation of Buddhism today. I mean, right now we are seeing a genuine explosion of interest in Buddhism. No question about that. Many different types of Buddhism. Lots of people come to Buddhist practice. But I wonder if there's a cautionary tale here. That doesn't necessarily guarantee that this is something that will continue. Sometimes I wonder. We'll have to see. But for the time being, I think we can ask some really interesting and important questions. For example, what can Swedenborgianism and Buddhism perhaps learn from each other? Do they have perspectives that can help illuminate each other. And please notice, I'm not referring so much to the original teachings, but to the traditions, to the way that they have developed. One thing that comes to mind looking at my own Zen tradition from a Swedenborgian perspective is I think it really highlights something that has become a very serious problem in the last generation. My own personal practice has been in Zen, and to tell the truth, I've been not only disappointed, but deeply disgusted by what's happened over the last generation or so. In case you're not familiar, there have been a large number of scandals affecting perhaps most of the major Zen centers in the United States. Various types of scandals, but most of them have involved male teachers, supposedly very deeply enlightened people, taking advantage of mostly women students and really abusing their authority. And this creates a huge problem. I mean, it's not only in Zen, you have some of it in Tibetan Buddhism. Curiously, you don't have very much, when I say Tibetan Buddhism, I mean Tibetan Buddhism here in the US, right? You don't have it so much in what's called insight meditation or vipassana. But nonetheless, it is there. And the question this raises is, how do we understand it? Supposedly, these teachers are deeply enlightened, deeply awakened, and yet they're behaving in these immoral ways. It's not just that they're having sex with students who throw themselves at the teachers. Rather, there's clearly predatory behavior going on in some cases. What is going on there? And it seems to me the Swedenborgian emphasis on deepest transformation or regeneration is pointing to the fact that the way it seems to have been working in American Zen is that awakening, enlightenment hasn't been deep enough. We can say perhaps that the teachers haven't been enlightened enough, or we could also perhaps say that maybe there's some confusion about what awakening or enlightenment is. Maybe there's some kind of romanticization, which, by the way, Suzuki himself, I think, encouraged to some degree. But somehow we might have romanticized what awakening is, and in fact, the reality of the deep regeneration that Swedenborg is talking about is much more complex and involves a much deeper transformation. In other words, I think that the Swedenborgian tradition can actually show us something about what actually needs to happen and how it is that the way the Zen tradition has articulated enlightenment, it's not happening deeply enough. But on the other side, looking at Swedenborgianism Buddhist perspective, the main reason I think Buddhism is so attractive at the moment is that it emphasizes the role of contemplative practice. It actually gives people something to do that, in Swedenborgian terms, would enable them or to help them open up and be more receptive to the influx that Swedenborg talks about. In other words, it's not simply a matter. And again, this is my understanding of the Swedenborgian tradition. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But my sense is that in Swedenborgianism, the emphasis is on self-study and self-discipline. In Buddhist terms, that would be something like studying the texts, becoming aware of the wide variety of Buddhist texts, and also following the precepts, the basic ethical precepts. But what's clear in the Buddhist tradition is that is not enough. That it's necessary to do something more to make sure that we are transformed in a way that is truly deep enough to be receptive, to open up to God's influx, to use Swedenborgian terms. My understanding is that Swedenborg himself probably used breathing techniques or some other types of practices to enable him to open up in the way that he did. And so here's the real question. Is it enough for us today, is it enough for Swedenborgians today, simply to accept what Swedenborg said, to believe in what he said, have faith in what he said, and live according to a certain type of moral code, or is something more needed? In the Buddhist tradition, there's a great deal of emphasis The idea isn't simply to have faith in the teachings of the Buddha and to follow the precepts. Very much in the Buddhist tradition, it's emphasized if we really want to awaken, we need to follow his example. I don't know how much of an option it is for us to sort of be taken by the Lord to visit heaven and hell in the way that Swedenborg was. But even apart from that, is it perhaps important for Swedenborgians also to have some types of contemplative practice, some types of meditation, some types of mindfulness that will perhaps encourage this to occur at a deeper level? Or maybe this is going on and I'm just ignorant of it, so please feel free to correct me later. Just to elaborate on this a little bit, it seems to me that the Buddhist path involves two sides, which I often talk about as the deconstruction of the sense of self and the reconstruction of the sense of self. Reconstruction, I think, is very similar to what Swedenborg was talking about. It's very interesting what the original Buddha had to say about karma. At the time he lived, most people in India believed in karma and physical rebirth, but they tended to understand it in a rather mechanical fashion. What the Buddha introduced was the importance of motivation. It's not just what you do, but the motivations behind what you do, so that the essence of karma has to do with transforming. If you want to improve your karma, what you need to do is make sure that what you do is motivated not by what are sometimes called the three poisons, or the three fires, greed, ill will, delusion, but rather it's important to transform those motivations to their more positive counterparts, generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom. This was, I think, the Buddha's real contribution to karma, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to accept physical rebirth. I mean, I think it can even be understood in a kind of naturalistic way, that he's giving us kind of a key, a golden key to not just, personal transformation or spiritual development. I think what is really going on here, and I think Swedenborg is saying much the same thing, is that if you want to transform the quality of your life, if you want to transform the way that you experience and relate to other people, and therefore the way that they also relate to you, there's a very simple way to do it. Not necessarily evil, but quite simple. What you need to do is transform your motivations. In that regard, I think Swedenborg is saying much the same thing. I was reading similar passages in Heaven and Hell earlier today, and I think that's very powerful. Nevertheless, that's only one side of Buddhist practice. The other side is the emphasis on what I call the deconstruction of the sense of self, or letting go of the sense of self. What's sometimes called awakening. I mean, that's the literal translation. The Buddha means the awakened one. In the Zen tradition, we talk about forgetting the self, because one of the great Japanese Zen masters, Dogen Kigen, said famously, to study Buddhism is to study yourself. To study yourself is to forget yourself. To forget yourself. To forget yourself is to realize your intimacy with your non-duality with the 10,000 things, to realize that you're not some kind of separate ego locked here behind the eyes looking out at an external world that's out here, but rather you realize that each of us realizes that we're really part of the whole, that in this case, David Loy is simply one of the many ways in which all of the causes and conditions of the universe, all of this sort of comes together, and I'm simply one expression of that, as are you. And we can say in the Zen tradition, there's a lot of emphasis that the only difference between us and a Buddha is that a Buddha realizes that. Whereas we are, according to the Buddhist tradition, we're still deluded, we still don't. We still have this sense of separation. And along with this sense of separation goes along the sense or the feeling that my well-being can be disconnected from yours. I don't have to worry too much about what happens to you because we're fundamentally different. So that's basically one question that I have for the Swedenborgian tradition, just looking at it from a Buddhist perspective. But now I want to shift to what I think is getting more at the heart of the issue because of the particular kind of circumstance we're in today. What do I mean by that? Well, very frankly and simply, I think we're in a state of crisis, urgency, which requires responses from all of us, but in particular raise really important issues for religious traditions. All religious traditions, but certainly including Buddhism and Swedenborgianism. What do I mean by crisis? I think you already know. Most obviously, we're in an ecological crisis. Not just climate change or global warming, those nice euphemisms for something that's probably a lot more better described as climate breakdown, climate crisis, something like that. And it's not even just climate crisis, of course. I mean, there are a lot of other things going on ecologically. I was quite disturbed to read something E.O. Wilson, the great Harvard biologist, wrote when he said he estimates that by the end of this century, approximately half of all the species on Earth, half of all the plant and animal species will either have gone extinct or will be so weakened that they will go extinct soon thereafter. Please reflect on that a moment. Not only are we in this one of the great extinction events of planet Earth, but the only extinction event caused by a particular species, that is to say us, our lifestyle, our way of living. The ecological crisis is certainly not the only one. I mean, I think the Great Recession, the economic crisis of 2008, that's far from over. Unless maybe you're a very wealthy person or a stockbroker or somebody like that. My sense is that that crisis is taking different forms, but it continues. And in particular, the growing gap between the wealthy and the rest of us, what's sometimes called the 1% and the 99%, the growing gap between rich and poor, not only is it so incredibly large, but it's continuing to accelerate. Which Chief Justice was it that said, we can have great disparities of wealth and poverty in this country, or we can have democracy, but we can't have both? It seems to me we're in a very critical time as far as coming to an answer to that question. And at the same time we have this urgency, we have what? We have political paralysis in Washington. I mean, I can go on and on about crises. You can pick your own. Overpopulation, for example. Something no politician wants to talk about because obviously there's no votes to be gained by telling people they should have fewer babies, right? But here's the situation. If this is true, if we are living in a time of great crisis and great urgency, what do the spiritual traditions have to contribute to that? Or let's make it more specific. What do Swedenborgianism and Buddhism have within what is the potential? What is the richness in those traditions that can help us understand and respond to these crises in an effective way? Thinking about this, I was quite struck to read in a history of Swedenborgianism what happened with the New Thought movement. I think it's not only Swedenborgian, but certainly much influenced by Swedenborgianism. How in the late 19th century and early 20th century, there was a split in the New Thought movement. And forgive me if I'm simplifying too much, but this is what I read. On the one hand, there were developing communities of people very concerned about social justice, or I think it was called then the social gospel, concerned about the social implications of the teachings. But on the other side, there was the development of a more individualistic stream. concerned more with personal success and positive thinking, which eventually led to things like Norman Vincent Peale, right, The Power of Positive Thinking, and more recently the book The Secret, enormous bestseller, right? And the emphasis here, it sort of easily, I don't know that it always amounts to what you might call prosperity gospel, but there's this very much, if you reform yourself in a certain kind of way, then it is much more likely that you will be successful. And God wants you to be rich or something like that. Again, I'm exaggerating here, but there's some of this tendency, the split between the social gospel and the individualistic, by coming to understand how positive thinking and so forth, that you can actually be more successful in the world individually. The reason I was really struck by this is it's exactly the same split, exactly the same conversation that's going on right now within the Buddhist community in this United States, in America. Exactly the same. On the one hand, you have the development of what's sometimes called socially engaged Buddhism. And if you want to find out more about that, you can look at the website of the Buddhist Peace Fellowship and so forth. And these are people very concerned about working out and developing some of the social, economic, political implications of Buddhist teachings. But at the same time, maybe I shouldn't just say at the same time, the truth is the interest in that is fairly small, and if anything, it might even be shrinking. In contrast, what you have is, in the last couple of years, an explosion of interest in what's now called the Mindfulness Movement. And I'm sure that many or most of you have come across some of that. That is to say, what many people are doing is sort of extracting, taking this one particular technique or contemplation practice in the Buddhist tradition and separating that out from anything else in Buddhism, from the precepts, from the moral grounding, from awakening, from ritual, from any of that, and just saying we have this particular technology to understand and control the mind, and that we can use this in many different ways, and ways that are often very beneficial, right? Mindfulness movement is generally a very good thing. Started, I believe, by John Kabat-Zinn at UMass, and he was using it to help people with chronic pain. And he discovered, yes, very helpful. It's been very important in educational institutions for helping vets with PTSD, post-traumatic stress. But it gets a bit complicated. It's also being used by the Department of Defense to train drone pilots. And it's also being used by corporations to make their employees more efficient, more productive, and therefore the corporations more profitable. Now that, in a sense, by itself, it's not necessarily such a bad thing, right? But here's the issue. For someone like myself, I can see within the Buddhist tradition implications that raise questions about the economic system. There are people who are talking from a Buddhist perspective and arguing that in a way our economic system has become institutionalized greed. If greed means you never have enough, consumers never consume enough, corporations are never profitable enough, their stock prices are never high enough, the GDP is never big enough. So there is a critique to be made there. And the concern is maybe what could happen to something like Buddhism is that it's going to be appropriated and it's going to be simply something that would be brought into the present kind of economic and social and political system to help us cope better. Whereas what I and other people see is there's also this potential for a Buddhist perspective that could really ask some very fundamental questions about what this system is all about, where it's going, and maybe alternatives that we need to explore. I was struck to read in a Swedenborgian journal, The Messenger, back in 1855. So it's quite old now. But this was the passage that really struck me. Not social reform, but internal reformation is the business of the church. In that striking contrast, right? It's all about individual, not anything to do about social reform. And the reason that struck me again is most Buddhists today, certainly in Asia, but also many in the US, would say much the same thing, right? In the Asian context, I think we can understand why that's the case, why it is that Buddhism could not develop a kind of social dimension or social gospel. Because all of the Asian Buddhist societies, none of them was democratic. And in every case, you had to be very careful about how you related to the ruler. Because if the king or whatever didn't like what you were doing, he could squash you. And sometimes they did. So the institution of Buddhism, as it developed, it had to be very careful not to alienate the king. And often they were somewhat dependent on him. It's usually a him, right? Dependent on him for some kind of support. So the result was, in social terms, the way Asian Buddhism developed, it tended to be a rather conservative force. More conservative than the Buddha himself. This is really striking to me. If you actually go back to the earliest Buddhist texts, we can see in at least two ways that the Buddha was actually quite a progressive. The two things that stand out for me are his attitude toward women and his attitude toward caste. Just to say a few words about each of those. At the time of the Buddha, women basically had incredibly low status in India, and they were not allowed to get involved in spiritual practices, certainly not in the Brahmanical religion. But the Buddha acknowledged and emphasized that women have exactly the same Buddha nature, the same potential to awaken as men, something we take for granted today. But 2,400 years ago, that was an incredible development. And so he created a new Sangha, a new community of nuns, the Bhikkhuni Sangha, that enabled them to practice. And we have wonderful reports in the earliest teachings of their own awakening experiences. It really worked. And yet, after the Buddha died and the Buddhism as an institution, the Sangha developed, what happened? The Bhikkhuni Sangha, the women's Sangha, disappeared pretty quickly. The men clearly made sure they had control of it, and then I think they just didn't support it very much. I think they didn't like the competition, is my guess, something like that. So there's an interesting contrast between the Buddha himself and the institution. And the problem that we still have, for the most part, that all Asian Buddhist societies are strongly patriarchal, despite the fact that it's pretty clear the Buddha himself was not. An even more striking example was the Buddha's attitude to caste, right? You're born in a caste. The caste system wasn't quite as developed or strong as it became later, but nonetheless, it was very much hierarchical, and it very much limited your possibilities. What did the Buddha say? Well, he created this community of practitioners. When you entered the Sangha, you lost your caste. There was no caste in the Sangha. You weren't even supposed to talk about it. That's huge. Clearly, he didn't like the caste system. And in a number of other ways, too, there are some fascinating stories that I don't have time to go into right now about maybe one story. Sorry. There were once a small group of Brahmins, high class young men. They decided they wanted to join the Buddhist Sangha, so they were out and they said, look, we're going to go join the Buddha, become monks, and but we want to give all our jewelry and fine clothes to Upali, our barber, our servant, or maybe even a kind of slave. And Upali said, well, wait a minute, if I take these, people will think that, I've killed you or stolen them, and they're going to kill me. So I better join the Sangha too. So they all go together, including Upali, to the Buddha. And the Buddha, when he checks them all out, he does something very interesting. He looks at these high caste people, and he sends them on a retreat. I think he's checking them out. Can you really handle it, But while they're gone, what does he do? He takes Upali, and he ordains him. Now, in the Buddhist tradition, there's no caste, but priority is determined by when you join the Sangha. which meant that Upali, the servant or slave of these high caste men, he would forever be their superior in the Sangha. He would forever be the one to choose his seat first, to take his food first, and so forth. What's going on there? What's the symbolism of that? That just shows me that there was something incredibly progressive going on. But when the Buddha died, what happened with the institution again? Well, again, in order for Buddhism to survive and thrive in very hierarchical societies, authoritarian, the way the system tended to work was the karma system, the karma teaching was used to rationalize the power of the king, right? Someone is born a prince, will become a king, must have really good karma from his past lifetime. Somebody else is born poor, deformed in some way. Sorry, don't blame it on anybody else. Somebody else is born a woman. Well, I'm sorry for you, but if you obey yourself and do what we tell you, you have a chance to be reborn a man in your next lifetime, this kind of thing. It's funny, but I'm sorry, this was the way it went. This was the way it developed, you see. What are we getting at here? The Buddha was actually far more progressive socially than the way the Sangha developed after him. And, again, this is the striking comparison. This is also some of my sense about Swedenborg, right? What do you think? I don't know enough on this. Please expand. But two things really stuck out for me. Number one, his attitude toward conjugal love and, if necessary, divorce or taking mistresses. The kind of a very progressive attitude that I think many early Swedenborgians didn't care for. And also, I think his attitude toward Africans and slaves. Am I correct in thinking that he was quite progressive on this? Again, please correct me later. But what this really reminds us is something I think quite important, that we tend to think of a religion as going in and having a bunch of values, and that gives the values to the society. But what this exemplifies is that the other also happens, that it works, or the other way around, that religions also absorb values, churches, the Buddhist tradition, the Buddhist institutions, the Sangha, and perhaps Swedenborgianism also tend to values that are generally accepted in that society. The point of all this being that if we look maybe with the right eye, we can see that there is a social dimension, a social concern certainly in the case of the Buddha, so that people have argued, some Buddhist scholars have argued that the Buddha really didn't just mean to found a religion, but he wanted to start a movement that would transform the whole of society. Very hard to tell from the early Buddhist text, but something like that going on. My question to you, as Swedenborgians, is there something similar there with Swedenborg himself? And the truth is, I've mentioned a couple things, but I don't really know. But let me try to bring all this to sort of a head, to a focus, by asking, okay, in the light of these crises, ecological, economic, social crises that we face today, does that help us to focus on this question, why do we regenerate? Why do we want to become awakened? What's the point of it? Is it simply because we want to ensure that after we die, we go to heaven? Is it our way of coping with our fear of death, that the kind of transformation or regeneration that we're concerned about is a means to the end of what will happen after we die? Or is it perhaps the case that the kind of transformation necessary is sufficient and necessary and vital, even if we're not so sure, as we're not in the modern world, even if we're not so sure about what happens after we die? I didn't say that very well. In the case of Swedenborg, perhaps it's a little bit unfortunate that his best-known work and most readable one, which I believe is heaven and hell, that's my experience anyway, that is almost solely focused on the afterlife. Because in the process of doing it, it seems to me it takes away attention from this life, despite the fact that Swedenborg in various places, right, he emphasizes that in a way, we're participating in heaven, we're in communication with angelic spirits. I forget the exact terminology here, but in other words, the kind of relationship that he's talking about isn't simply something that involves what happens after we die, but in a very important way, the influx is happening right here and now. I'm just wondering how much the afterlife focus has been maybe a bit unfortunate in that it's taken away enough concern for what's going on right here. The same thing is very much the case in Buddhism. If you look at popular Buddhism in Asia, well, first of all, look at the sanghas, the monks, the communities. Traditionally, the way Buddha, I'm not at all sure this was the Buddha's original idea, but the way it developed is the understanding that this world here that we're in now is the world of samsara. That is to say, the world of suffering, craving, ignorance, delusion. And the idea ultimately is to check out in the sense of not being reborn here. That's the ultimate goal of nirvana. That's what achieving nibbana is for early Buddhism, Southern Buddhism. And maybe it's not surprising then that for many lay people, they're not in such a hurry. And if you go in Highland or one of the societies in Southeast Asia, for example, the lay people, they don't want to check out. They're not eager to attain nibbana, not sure what it is. But in any case, they're a lot more interested in having a more favorable rebirth and making merit by giving things, especially to the monks, that sort of deposits some merit in their heavenly bank account so that when they're reborn, they will be reborn maybe to a wealthier family or in a better situation. So for Asian Buddhism too, there's a lot of emphasis on the Buddhist path as, again, preoccupied with trying to get a handle on, trying to get some control of what happens to us after we die. At the same time, just as there is some tension in Buddhism, just as there's some tension in Swedenborgianism about the fact that there's a sense in which we're participating in heaven or hell right here and now, we don't have to wait until we die, that likewise there are lots of interesting things going on in the Buddhist tradition that sort of challenge this afterlife preoccupation. For example, the greatest Buddhist philosopher, Nagarjuna, pretty definitely the second most important person in the whole of the Buddhist tradition. One of his main emphases is that samsara is nothing other than nibbana, the place that is the world of suffering. The world of suffering is also the world, the place of nibbana. The difference is how we experience it and how we relate to it. So for him, the goal isn't to attain nibbana and check out. The goal is rather to, as a result of practice, to transform how we experience the world and how we experience ourselves so that we live in a different way. And there's other things that I could mention, but one in particular is worth the way Japanese Buddhism developed. In East Asia, the most important type of Buddhism is not Zen, certainly not Zen, but what's sometimes called Pure Land, a much more devotional understanding of a kind of cosmic Buddha, Amitabha Buddha. And the idea that after we die, we can go, if we have faith in him, then we can go to his Pure Land where it's very easy to practice and from which it's easy to gain nirvana, full enlightenment, right? What's really striking is that the most popular form of Pure Land Buddhism in Japan, that is the Pure Land expounded by Shinran, Jodo Shinshu it's called, the emphasis there is not that we can go to the Pure Land if we believe and appeal to Amida Buddha when we die. But the focus there for him, for Shinran, is the emphasis, we are already living in the Pure Land right here and now. The whole point of practice is to help us realize that and to express our gratitude to Amida Buddha for being, for living within his Pure Land. Again, I think you can see what I'm getting at here. The shift in emphasis from understanding the point of the spiritual path as attaining something after we die, going somewhere after we die, and rather emphasizing more that the kind of transformation we're aiming at is a transformation in the way we experience and the way we live in the world right here and now, regardless of what happens after we die. I recently read a fascinating book by a scholar named Loyal Rue, who said essentially, and I'm going to restate what he said for this context. He said, religious traditions like Swedenborgianism and Buddhism, they were included in under his rubric, right? He says, these types of religious traditions, in his opinion, their influence is going to continue to decline. They are going to become less and less relevant in the modern world. Pretty strong claim, less and less relevant. For two reasons. They have two fundamental, deep, principles that make it very problematical for them to engage with our world in the way that we need to engage with it now, given the kind of crises we have. And the two that he picked out are, number one, cosmological dualism, and number two, individual salvation. By cosmological dualism, it means that this world is understood in relationship to another higher world. For Christians, heaven, God in heaven. For Buddhists, nibbana, that this world is samsara in classical Buddhism, and nirvana is somehow somewhere else. There's this contrast. And not only is there this contrast, but there's a kind of subtle or not so subtle devaluation of this world as to this higher world. What we need to recognize, of course, is that the notion of cosmological dualism becomes a lot more problematic in the modern world, where something like science doesn't seem to have any way to understand something like that, right? What am I getting at? In the case of Buddhism, in so many ways, Buddhism seems like a very modern religion or tradition, spiritual tradition, whatever you want to call it. In so many ways, what the things it has to say, the emphasis, permanence, insubstantiality, interdependence, the way language deceives us, the constructed nature of the sense of self. In all these ways, Buddhism seems very contemporary. It sort of fits into the modern world quite well. But of course, the big sticking point that we all face when we try to sort of understand Buddhism in the modern world is, what are we going to make out of karma when it's understood as some sort of cosmological law of nature, and in particular, rebirth? The truth is, as a Buddhist practitioner and as a Buddhist scholar, I don't know how literally to take it. And because I don't know how literally to take it, I'm also wary to live and practice as a Buddhist only with reference to that, you see. I'm not willing to be a Buddhist practitioner where my concern is simply to improve my karma or to try to check out of this world to go to somewhere else. I think the challenge of modern science really, it raises some very significant questions that become difficult to deal with. I'm wandering a bit here. But of course, the same thing would apply with Swedenborgianism, in the sense that the truth is, I don't know whether what Swedenborg said is true, whether in fact there is a heaven or whether it operates in the way, the heaven and hell operates in the way that you talked about. Actually, I hope there is, and I certainly hope if there is a heaven and hell that they operate in that way. But the truth is, I'm not sure. And when I read some of the other things he writes, for example, about life on other planets, I get confused. So there's a kind of, what I'm saying is, on the one hand, I'm very attracted. It makes a lot of sense. It may well be true. But is it the case that I want to live my life in such a way that that's all I'm concerned about? Planning for what's going to happen after I die, it's my way of dealing with my mortality? Or is in fact, maybe we're somehow turning that upside down? The second point, of course, is not just cosmological dualism, but the other issue is cosmological dualism is connected with individual salvation, that we individually make it to this higher realm, right? So in the case of Buddhism, you might have the Arhat, the highly awakened Buddhist, who says, I'm not going to be reborn. I'm going to Nibbana, whatever that may mean. Now, you, my friends, I hope that you will go to Nibbana too, but whether or not you do or you continue to be reborn in this world in suffering, well, it ain't going to affect me because I'm going to be in Nibbana. Is it the same thing in the Christian tradition? I'm wondering if any of you read any of those Left Behind books. That ring a bell? I think there were a couple made for television movies as well. The Left Behind, I read the first one, and it was quite fascinating in one way. Maybe not the way the author intended, but the main thing I remember from that book was a very early scene. I think a husband and a wife are on a plane. They're on a plane, and suddenly the wife and a number of other people disappear because the rapture has happened, right? Remember that? And she disappears, and just clothes are there. I guess the rapture wear clothes. But she and a number of other people are gone, right? Remember that? And meanwhile, the husband is left. Evidently, he wasn't quite good enough. And also, I think they have a couple children that are left with a babysitter. And I thought, well, this is a really strange, heaven is the place of great bliss. And here this woman has disappeared, gone to heaven. She's left her husband, who clearly loves her. And she's left her two children. They're two young children somewhere with a babysitter. And she's supposed to be up in heaven enjoying being blissful by herself. And, I hope you can join me, but whether or not you do, it's pretty nice up here singing to the angels and all that sort of thing. I think you can see my point here, that there's something a little uncomfortable, something very problematic about this way of thinking. To cash in the point here, both of these fundamental problems that Loyal Rue points to, the cosmological dualism that focuses our attention in a higher world and devalues to some extent, the world as the means to that higher world, that's the main focus. And the idea of individual salvation, that my well-being is ultimately separate from your well-being. Today, these have become extremely problematical because they, or insofar as, let's say that, insofar as the tendency is to divert our attention from right here and now and the enormous problems that we have today in favor of escaping, going somewhere else. In the case of Buddhism, it seems to me that as Buddhism modernizes and globalizes, I think it's very important that we refocus it on this world, right here and now, to understand the Buddhist path about, as I said earlier, deconstructing and reconstructing the sense of self, so that I experience myself and I experience the world in a different way, in a more non-dual way, and I live according to that. This was summarized wonderfully by Nisargadatta, who put it so pithily and so perfectly. He said, when I look inside and see that I am nothing, that's wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that's love. Between these two, my life turns. And kind of reconstruction then is, if I'm really fully invested, fully part of this world, if I realize by waking up that my own well-being cannot be ultimately distinguished from the well-being of everyone else, if there's a sense in which I cannot be fully enlightened then unless all of you are awakened, that involves inevitably a social commitment, a social concern to address the kinds of ecological, social, political, economic issues that I spoke of earlier. What happens after I die, though? I don't know. I'll be quite honest. I don't know. But here's the other side of it. I don't need to know. That's not part of the job description. If I do the very best that I can right here and now, that will take care of itself. That means I can have a kind of agnosticism. I hope Swedenborg's heaven works. I hope what Buddhism says about awakening works. I really do, but nevertheless, that'll take care of itself if I do the very best that I can right here. It's kind of the opposite of Pascal's famous wager. Do you remember that? He said, you should believe in God, because if you believe in God, then, and it's not true, well, you really haven't lost anything. But if you believe in God, and it is true, then you've gained eternity. Well, in a way, I'm kind of turning it around and saying, our task, given the crises we face, all the crises we faced, our task is to really become completely concerned about trying to understand, trying to address these urgent issues. And if we really do that, the kind of reformation, regeneration, the kind of transformation that will occur to us, that will be enough to take care of whatever happens after we die. Is the same true for Swedenborgianism? Let me finish with a fascinating quotation that I found in Marguerite Bloch's book, The New Church and the New World, toward the end. The new church in general has ignored the mystical side of religion, though it's absolutely inherent in the doctrine of influx, the entrance of God into the individual soul, as well as in the doctrine of perception or interior reception of spiritual truth. Whether or not Swedenborg himself was a mystic in the usual sense of the word needn't be discussed, but the fact remains that in his doctrines lie the germs of a new type of mysticism, anchored firmly to life, this world, by the doctrine of use, and yet glowing with celestial light. Perhaps in the development of this new mysticism, the new church will perform its greatest service to the new age. It seems to me that's exactly the same challenge for Buddhism today, by the way. The kind of mysticism she mentions, emphasizing influx, again, it focuses on the here and now. And it seems to me that if we all focus on what we need to do right now to make this world a better place, then what happens in the afterlife to us individually or collectively? As I said, I think we can trust, we can have the deep faith that that will take care of itself. Thank you very much.